I feel like covering this topic in a video format makes me a lot more nervous and anxious about the possible reception than I was initially upon writing it. Adapting it for a video format and uploading it to YouTube shifts it a lot more beyond my personal control, but at the same time it has the hope of reaching a much broader audience than just people who might stumble upon it or people who directly follow me on Twitter. In addition, my experience with this subject matter has changed rather drastically over the course of the last year. When I initially wrote this back in February of this year, I was emboldened by the H-Bomber Mermaid stream and how incredibly positive and constructive that was, not just for the trans community, but for the rest of the LGBTQ+ community, including allies, bringing everyone together for a common purpose, asking Graham Lanahan how to beat Beaver Bother. But since the original writing of this whole thing, I feel a lot more disillusioned with the positivity that sprung up from that stream. Obviously, it wasn't done with the intent of telling bigots to shut the fuck up, but rather to help raise money for a well-deserving charity, but something within me still hoped that such a huge spectacle would change the hearts and minds of people that hate people like me, based solely on facets of ourselves that we can't control. That hope and optimism came crumbling down when the lead developer of one of my favorite games, Heartbeat, turned out to be a massively transphobic TERF, which is something that is somewhat outside the scope of this video, and I've already assured friends and fans that I'm done talking about it in any serious manner for the sake of my own mental health, so we're not gonna go into detail on that whole thing in this video. If you're at all curious about what the hell I'm talking about, I'll link to an article I wrote earlier in the year in the down below part. I've already waffled on quite a bit and haven't even vaguely addressed the core premise of this video or even introduced myself, so let's do those two things right now. I'm Luka, and don't let the husky baritones of my voice fool you, I am a trans woman who has been openly out on the internet for the last 3 or 4 years. The correlation between being trans and being an avid gaming enthusiast who spends countless hours talking and writing about games means that I have a particular interest in trans characters represented within video games. Obviously, that is such an obvious statement that it doesn't really need to be said, but here I am saying it for the sake of total clarity, and because I'm well aware of the fact that some gamers are completely dense. Ha ha he he gamers. The history of trans representation in games media is, well, spotty to say the least. It ranges all across the spectrum from the abysmal lows of, oh my god, this was absolutely terrible, I hate it, to the stellar highs of, they got this so right and I'm crying my eyes out. But before we get to the highs, we must unfortunately discuss the lows by virtue of them being the first, and second, and third. Actually, it took almost 20 years for us to get to any highs. At all. Ugh, boy. It's fairly widely contested within the trans gaming community which character could be considered the first trans character in video games, and, being entirely frank, some of it is entirely open to a person's own interpretation. That's not me saying that I'm going to be going on at length about characters that are not confirmed in canon to be trans, sorry chic, but I would be remiss not to mention some of the most notable characters that a person could perceive to be trans, even if the canon doesn't necessarily follow that train of thought. First things first though, the most commonly accepted first trans character in video games is, well, yeah. This horrific nightmare creature, as everyone likely knows, is Birdo, though she's apparently known as Catherine in Japan, which is weirdly relevant. First appearing in Super Mario Bros. 2, or I guess Doki Doki Panic, released in 1988. The description for the character in the instruction manual for the game reads, he thinks he is a girl and spits eggs from his mouth, which is not great. That's going to be a running theme going forward. Also, just for the record, that instruction manual and that specific wording is still available on Nintendo's official Japanese website, so, you know, that's interesting. The mishandling of Birdo as a potential trans character is further carried on in the thankfully unlocalized game Captain Rainbow. Her appearance in the game goes as so. It turns out that Birdo has been in jail on Mimmin Island for using a women's restroom. She asks Captain Rainbow to find proof that she's a female so that she can get out of jail, and he does, buzzing under her pillow. Not only is it uniquely skeevy to attribute a woman's status as a woman to the ownership of a vibrator, the concept of Birdo being thrown in jail for using a women's restroom is, well, admittedly eerily relevant in today's society, but also reads as intentionally insensitive in light of it having only come out in 2008, something I've heard is a recurring theme of Captain Rainbow. Thank God we don't have to deal with a generation of gamer chuds that played it. So, with all of that being said, it's reasonable to assume and even overtly state that Birdo is the first trans character in video games, right? Well, yes and no. There was a small wrench thrown into the works in 1994. Enter Samus Aran, whatever. Badass space bounty hunter from the iconic game Metroid, released in 1986, 2 years before Birdo's first appearance. In 1994, an interview with the game's developers was published in Super Metroid Strategy Guide, which is thankfully made available on Metroid Database. One of the people that designed Samus, Hirofumi Matsuoka, said that Samus wasn't a woman and referred to her as a new half. For those who may be uninformed, the term new half is effectively the Japanese equivalent of words like she-male, which is the word that you'll see in the source for the Metroid database down below. Not great! However, a later interview with Yoshio Sakamoto, also known as that guy that ruined Metroid with Other M and also, I guess, directed some other Metroid games, joked that Samus was just as likely to be transgender as a Metroid game was to be released on the PlayStation 2. Which, I don't get. Like, how is that a joke? What's the funny part? Can someone explain it to me? Despite that guy that ruined Metroid with Other M and also, I guess, directed some other Metroid games' denial of Samus's theorized gender identity, in this specific case, I wouldn't begrudge anyone for considering Samus to be the first trans person in video games. We find representation where we can, and even if Sakamoto seems to disagree with the notion, like an asshole, sure, why not? Samus can be the first trans woman in video games. I don't personally think so, but to each their own. It beats the eldritch abomination that Birdo is anyway. So with all of my nitpicking in regards to these characters being the first examples of representation in this form of media, one might be wondering who, if not the egg-spitting monstrosity or the buxom blonde bounty babe, do I consider to be the first proper example?
Oh, worn out already. Beg for more! Can't start the show without the star.
Poison from the classic beat-em-up Final Fight, first gracing the grimy screens of arcade cabinets in 1989. Poison is everything. I am not exaggerating in saying that I absolutely adore nearly every single thing about this character. Nearly. Her origins are dubious at best, at least if you believe speculation from gamers and games journalists. I'll touch on that again in a second. It is speculated by fans and journalists alike that back in the ancient days of the late 80s, when the folks at Capcom were bringing Final Fight out to the West, there was a small concern that maybe feminist groups in America might not be super happy about the idea of beating the absolute crap out of a woman in a video game. The rumor is that the developers of the game were so afraid that they were going to get sued that they changed the character of Poison from that of a spunky rock and roll cis girl to that of a rough and tumble trans woman or new half, under the perception that because the character was biologically male, it would be fine that you were beating the crap out of them because they were not, quote-unquote, technically a woman. This speculation also feeds into the idea, most commonly perpetuated by chuds on Twitter and forums, that Poison is and has always been a cis woman and the notion of her being trans is invalid because it was a concession made to avoid litigation. However, Evan Lateria of the University of California posits in the book Rated M for Mature that this speculation doesn't actually have all that much factual merit. Japanese data, however, does not support this claim. In numerous design documents and magazine articles, Poison's gender, new half, is not ambiguous. It is quite clear that from the start, Poison was designed to appeal to a rising Japanese fascination with the spectacle of the new half, which gained media popularity in the 1980s. Going further to say, more likely, however, Poison was imagined as a new half much earlier on in the design process, and Japan's own understandings of gender and sexuality rendered her gender expression and identity incommensurable with Nintendo of America's censorship policy. Despite Capcom USA's knowledge of Nintendo of America's strict guidelines, the cultural differences between Japan and the United States regarding transgender folks resulted in her elimination from the Super Nintendo Entertainment System console port of Final Fight. In an effort to assure quality under Nintendo's guidelines, transgender representation was not permitted. The curious thing about this upheaval on the belief as to how we wound up with Poison as the character we know her as today is that the audience speculated reasoning behind Poison's transness seems to have pervaded Capcom itself, and not even they can reconcile the truth of the matter between the company and developers employed by them. In an interview, Yoshinori Ono, a Capcom veteran and producer on many a Street Fighter game, made the distinction that Poison was post-op in North America, but simply tucks her business away to look female in her Japanese appearances. Problematic wording aside, he seems to be one of the only people at Capcom to acknowledge Poison's historic characterization, noting later that the company itself doesn't have a stance technically. One of the more frustrating things about Poison's status as a trans character is Capcom's complete and utter refusal to confirm or deny basic elements that would make it far easier to define her as a trans character. This frustration surrounding their apprehension to discuss the matter is only compounded when you take into consideration that they worked with GLAD for her appearance in Street Fighter Cross Tekken to ensure that she was represented appropriately and that anything potentially offensive in the original cut wouldn't be so. Now, for the sake of clarity and having the opportunity to tell a bunch of childish, ignorant gamer chuds to shut the fuck up, it should be noted that Ono's distinction was not between whether or not she is a trans or cis woman. The distinction that he made was whether she was post-op or pre-op, meaning, well, whether or not those shorts would be incredibly uncomfortable while fighting. The discussion surrounding Poison is not whether or not she's trans. Her design document is unambiguous in describing her as a new half. Many of the games contain allusions to her gender identity. Capcom consulted GLAD on her appearance in Street Fighter Cross Tekken, and Yoshinori Ono corroborates her status as a trans symbol. This is not up for debate. She's trans. Fucking deal with it. Moving on, you'll have to be a little bit patient with me because I am about to expose myself as possibly a fake video game fan. This next example is not one that I am personally incredibly familiar with because I kind of stopped playing Nintendo games after the N64. However, a character that I've heard to be actually well written, handled respectfully, and tends to be generally well liked by the community is Vivian from Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door. From what I've heard, some people might be completely unaware of the fact that Vivian is trans, mostly due to the localization cutting this detail out almost entirely, which further corroborates Evan Lateria's speculation that it might be what happened with Poison. In the original Japanese writing of the game, using Goombella's tattle skill on Vivian in battle would yield the result, one of the Shadow Group. Vivian appears to be a girl but is really a boy. Considering Birdo's description, we shouldn't really expect much better from Nintendo, unfortunately. The societal viewpoint on pretty much anything LGBTQ related in Japan is kind of a problem. Aside from that, Vivian seems to be handled really well. The only characters in the game that disrespect her identity are her two sisters, but they are quite literally villains and you know, get to beat the crap out of them, which is nice. Other characters in the game refer to Vivian as a girl, call her cute every now and then, and make her feel welcome as their friend and party member. Wholesome all around. Yes, I am including beating up transphobes in that wholesomeness. Now, before we get into what I think is the most recent example of really good trans representation and characterization, we must unfortunately discuss the one that I think I find more egregious and unacceptable than all the others that came before it. 3 of them came from the 80s, which, while obviously not excusing their problematic nature, makes it at least slightly more understandable. It was a different time, they came from Japan, etc, etc. The next character also came from Japan, but not really from a different time, unless you consider 2011 to be an entirely different year from now, which honestly you would be forgiven for, considering 2016 changed a lot. And I'm going to be honest, this one stings quite a bit because I actually really fucking like the character.
So, did I hear someone call for me?
Oh, hey, Erica!
I've got a nice pair of stiletto heels I know how to use.
Erica Anderson is probably one of the best written trans characters in video games. She has an amazing personality, she's incredibly charming, and just snarky enough to make me fall completely and utterly in love with her.
Because she's my type. Oh.
Unfortunately, the developers of the game didn't exactly feel the same way that I did. To give a brief overview of the plot of the game, because it is necessary, there is a mysterious curse plaguing whatever nation this game takes place in, America, Japan, whatever, wherein a man who has cheated on their significant other finds themselves trapped in a dream in which they are forced to climb a constantly deteriorating tower. Otherwise they will die, both in the dream and in real life. Erica is a waitress at the bar that the game's protagonist, Vincent, and his friends frequent. You have the opportunity to talk to her in the short segments of the game where you walk around and talk to the bar's patrons and staff. You become familiar with her, who she is, her personality, all of that good stuff. If you play the game, you're likely to have as much affection for her as I do. The problems start to come in around the end of the game. You see, the curse I mentioned before happens to only affect men, right? It affects Erica. This is the first hint to Erica's true identity, for lack of a better term, and is paid off in the good ending of the game, where it is revealed that one of Vincent's friends, Toby, hooked up with Erica throughout the course of the game and discovered that Erica is, in fact, trans.
Life is so freaking unfair, you know? I'm never gonna win big like him.
Oh,
Erica!
don't you worry now. We'll always have each other, sweet pea.
The other guys knew you was Eric back in school. I want my damn V-card back.
Sorry, but once that hole is punched, there's no refund.
Oh, come on, Johnny, please, for the love of God, stop recording me.
While this seems relatively tame, the entire situation is played off as a joke. Erica's identity as a trans woman isn't taken seriously in the slightest, and it's something that the audience is meant to laugh at. Like, it's funny, you know? That this guy named Eric thinks he's a woman? Haha! Good joke, P Studio. You sure got me with that one. And then the game's credits straight up dead name her.
Newsflash, fuck you.
She is credited as Eric Anderson, a name that we, as the player, have not known her as, have never referred to her as, and have only ever heard once in the entire time we've played the game. Only in this one specific ending in a game that has 5. Suffice it to say, the blatant mishandling right at the end was something of a punch to the gut and a nice loogie hugged straight into the eye. What frustrates me the most about this character is that I, again, really like her. She's an incredibly likable character with goals and ambitions, and you know, she's generally well-rounded, which is something that the vast majority of the characters in the game kind of lack. So for her to suddenly be disrespected in such a manner, it hurts. Not that this sort of thing is exactly unexpected of Atlas. To stir the pot and possibly rile anyone up, especially considering Persona 5 Royale and Scramble are around the corner, and people seem super jazzed for them despite certain things being added to the game. But, hey, Persona is, incredibly gross in terms of LGBTQ plus representation. Like, not just in the way that Birdo or Poison are possibly. P Studio seems like actively malicious. Barring any mention of the first 2, 3, however many games came before Persona 3, because I never played those ones and have no real intent on doing so, the Persona franchise is absolutely rife with downright awful, insensitive, and offensive gay and trans representation. Starting with Persona 3, there is a point in the game where one of the primary party members, Junpei, suggests that he and the rest of the male characters go on a mission to hit on women at the beach, subsequently referred to as Operation Babe Hunt. They are met with rejection on all fronts except one, and it's hilarious. The only woman that responds well to their flirtation was a trans woman, which, right off the bat, is already falling into the stereotype of trans people being deviants, perverts, pedophiles, or all 3. The following series of events is one of the characters finally cluing into the fact that this woman has an Adam's apple, and the group subsequently runs away, which is played for comedic effect. As if that's funny. Somebody please explain the joke to me. Persona 4 is thankfully devoid of transphobia for the most part, but replaces it with homophobia. Really, really flagrant homophobia. To briefly summarize, the character of Kanji Tatsumi is heavily implied in the game to be bisexual. He describes that he's attracted to both men and women and seems generally confused by it, as would be expected from a high school freshman. His supposed friend, Yosuke Hanamura, reacts completely and utterly horrified each and every single time this element of Kanji's character is so much as vaguely hinted at. And this is, again, played for comedic effect. Speaking of Yosuke, however, his terrified and uncomfortable reaction to Kanji's potential bisexuality would make perfect sense within the context of he himself being deeply, deeply closeted and showing symptoms of internal homophobia. And it would have been great for the game to explore that and the romantic social link that Yosuke was totally going to have with the game's protagonist before it got cut from the game for some Reason? Additionally, the true ending of Persona 4 Golden almost entirely wipes out how these characters were portrayed and characterized for the entire game, implying that the happiest ending for these characters was coming to conform to the societal norms and ideals that led to them repressing their true selves in the first place. So, yeah. That fucking sucks. Continuing the trend of the series gradually getting better, Persona 5 is mostly okay, at least in regards to LGBTQ+ discrimination. It does still have a particularly grotesque social link subplot that horribly mishandles themes and narratives relating to child sexual abuse, but that is somewhat outside the purview of this specific video. The only instance of egregious mishandling of LGBTQ+ characters is the very brief appearance of two gay male characters who hit on and subsequently drag an underage boy away from his friend so they can, presumably, have their way with him, or as they put it, party. And the protagonist just kinda stands there and doesn't do anything, despite the fact that his friend is probably in actual danger. And this is played as a joke. Please, someone, oh god, explain the joke to me. But okay, I've deviated from the topic of the video for a bit too long now. I just can't resist the temptation to dunk on P Studio and point out how fucking gross they are whenever I get the chance. Now we come to the shining diamond in all of this, the only example of trans representation in games media that I personally think gets it all right. Though, granted, Dragon Age Inquisition seems to also get it pretty good. And yeah, this video is on the verge of wrapping up, and because I know there are quite a few characters I missed in between 86 and now, I figure I should at least make sure people are aware that these characters exist, because it's important that people know that there is representation for us out there. It may be rare, and it may, more often than not be very good, but it's out there, and there are people in the games industry that are doing their best to make sure we don't feel left out and that we feel represented, and I think that's great, but we'll touch more on that at the end of the video. Beamdog Studios included a fairly well-handled trans character in an expansion for Baldur's Gate titled Siege of Dragonspear and dealt with a surge of harassment for having done that. BioWare, for all of their misgivings in recent years, wrote Krem in Dragon Age Inquisition, who is the only trans man that I can actually think of, and holy shit, that's fucking depressing now that I say it out loud. The character of Flea in Chrono Trigger, while not particularly handled well, is generally regarded to be a trans character based on their in-game text. They may not appear in the game all that much, but hey, they're there. Miranda Comey in Watch Dogs 2 is a city councilor in San Francisco, and one of the first missions in the game is retaliating against a cult that released video of her sexual reassignment surgery, and she's a fucking great character, and holy shit, that game is good. Anyway, I digress. If you want to see and learn more about these characters, go play the games that they're in, or just, I don't know, go wiki diving, I guess. Let's talk about JJ McField.
JJ!
Hey, this way.
The Missing, JJ McField and the Island of Memories is a game released in 2008, developed by Hidetaka Suehiro, otherwise known as Swery65. If that name sounds at all familiar, it's probably because he previously directed an absolute masterpiece called Deadly Premonition. The game starts off with two girls going off on a camping trip together, and as the opening cutscene goes on, you get the slightest indication that the two of them are romantically involved. I say slightest, but they literally kiss in the opening cutscene. Don't let that get in the way of the Steam description of the game or anything though. So, starting from that point, you would probably be thinking that the splash screen at the start of the game that reads, "This game was made with the belief that no one is wrong for being what they are," is probably in reference to the two characters being gay. And you'd only be half right. As the story of the game progresses through text messages that JJ receives on her phone, you start to get the indication that not all with these characters is as it seems. People that regard JJ to be a friend treat her differently than you would a young girl, She is incredibly reserved and short with her mother, and there's a guy talking to her about his YouTube channel that is all about the most dude bro shit imaginable. It's a bit off. The truth of the matter isn't properly revealed until fairly close to the end of the game. JJ's mother finds clothing in her room that is out of place. She questions her daughter about them, and JJ passes them off as if they're her friend Emily's. But it's made to be a bigger deal than you would expect it to be if both characters are known to be female. Things escalate until the point that the secret is revealed. JJ is a trans woman. Her mother starts out trying to bring her to therapy, begging her to come home from college so that they can get things sorted out, insinuating that JJ is mentally unwell and that letting her leave home was a mistake. The story progresses and it's revealed that all of the events of the game were fiction. JJ had been on the verge of death and hallucinated the entire thing. In reality, she was laying on the floor of her school's auditorium, wrists slit, and being resuscitated by a paramedic. As it turns out, JJ shared her secret with her mother, and it didn't go over well. With all of her own doubts and insecurities coupled with her mother now entirely freaking out, JJ saw no other way forward than attempting to kill herself, explaining the theme of self-mutilation that ran through the game. But throughout the course of the near-death dream that she had, she learned to embrace who she really is, and upon waking up and seeing the face of the girl that she loves, the game ends.
We were so young, so happy to believe, but those days.
Did you find what you were looking for?
So show
You better not lose it again.
a way to see how far from you I've been driven. Tell me
Abilities,
that
late pop,
everything's okay tonight.
and then you ring. Then medicine memory shots.
JJ McField works so well as a character, not only because the situation that she has found herself in is one that a lot of trans people can relate to, but because throughout the game she is really well characterized. She's deeply passionate about antiques, fairly unfamiliar with things in pop culture, tends to be a bit short with friends and family, but is genuinely loving and caring and compassionate when the time calls for it. I don't think it's too brazen of a claim to say that JJ McField is one of the best examples of trans representation in video games, which is something that will probably come as a bit of a surprise to anyone that played Deadly Premonition or watched my Let's Play of it, because that game didn't handle the subject matter entirely well. And you know what? Fuck it. I said in that Let's Play that I was going to talk about Thomas at some point, and here I am, talking about trans representation and raving about The Missing, made by the same guy that made Deadly Premonition. So let's just get into it right now and point out how Swery has grown as a writer and make all of this sort of a teachable moment. Alright, so there's this character that you meet early on in Deadly Premonition named Thomas. He's quiet, dainty, skilled in various feminine skills such as cooking, and the protagonist refers to him with an epithet that implies that he might be of a certain queer persuasion. Beyond this, there's no real mention of Thomas being anything other than a less than the epitome of masculinity, straight cis dude. Up until the third act, where it's revealed that he has a bit of a penchant for dressing up in women's clothing, acting like a woman, sharing physical relationships with men, and so on. There's no specific mention that Thomas identifies as anything other than male, no direct allusion to him possibly being trans, and no one calls him anything but Thomas throughout the entire course of the game, even during the third act. Additionally, male pronouns are consistent up to the credits, but his mannerisms, manner of dress, and overall personality shift into a much more feminine presence, and he regards Emily, one of the primary characters in the game, with the same contempt and vitriol that you'd expect from the stereotypical representation of a woman's scorn.
It was so much better back then. We had so much fun.
What are you talking about?
Emily?
It's like
That
Thomas
was
is having a
before you
conversation
came.
of his own. What did Emily do?
I won't let you have him.
Oh.
You filthy pig!
Okay, well that's rude. With all of this being said, I am still undecided as to whether or not this inclusion is problematic or not. With it not being specifically called to attention that Thomas is trans, it's hard to say that he's an example of trans representation, thus making it difficult to call it problematic representation. On the other hand, it so obviously alludes to queerness and is so clearly a reference to the character of Denise Bryson from Twin Peaks that it's difficult to fully discredit. The vagueness of what Swery intended with Thomas is what makes me the most uncomfortable, I guess. With no real way to know what he intended and not really being able to use the material itself as a means to identify what the intent was, I'm left unable to determine how Swery, even at that time, felt in regards to trans people and if Thomas's heel turn was meant in bad faith or not. My concerns were later assuaged by a very brief Twitter interaction with the man himself after I had the pleasure of playing through The Missing and seeing how the manner with which he handled these topics had changed so dramatically. While I didn't have the chance to ask what his intent was with Thomas and what the whole deal there even really was, I did learn one thing that made my concerns more or less melt away. Throughout the course of writing The Missing, Swery had consulted with people that had gone through similar experiences to ensure that the game had a note of authenticity and so as not to repeat the mistakes of Deadly Premonition, which really shows in just how close to home it hits for pretty much every trans person I've talked to that has played it. Like, uncomfortably close to home. It might be optimistic for me to say this, especially considering the game has already become more or less forgotten within the general gaming community, but I sincerely hope that The Missing goes down in history as a vital cornerstone in the progress towards positive LGBTQ+ representation in games media. I would also like for it to serve as an example of how a person's possible ignorance to queer issues can eventually be remedied and redeemed just by the simple act of exposure, like it was with Swery, which is a primary reason that you see so many people pushing not only for gay or trans representation in games media, but also for representation of people of color. Minority representation in games media doesn't have to be as rocky and tumultuous as it has been for the last 30-odd years. You, the person watching this video, could write the next fantastic trans video game character that doesn't have to have some weak justification to simply exist. You could create a non-binary character that doesn't fit into the stereotype of being an inhuman robot. We don't have to have faith that currently established game developers are going to spearhead these ideals for us. And if you're not in the business of writing or game development, support and uplift creators that are. Follow trans creators on Twitter and YouTube. Buy games that include great representation of trans people. I'll even link a few in the description to get you started. The point is, we don't have to wait for people to do this for us. We don't have to wait to see ourselves represented in the media that we love. We can create it ourselves. We can be the change that we want to see. Hey, I did manage to sneak a positive, uplifting message in there at the end. I genuinely didn't expect that.